There is a specific, suffocating brand of tragedy reserved for the woman who trades her entire kingdom to buy a man a crown, only to watch him use his new royal authority to banish her from the castle. For over a decade, I believed that true love was synonymous with absolute, unconditional sacrifice. I believed that if I poured enough of my own brilliance, my own capital, and my own sweat into the foundation of my husband's dreams, we would eventually stand on the balcony of our shared empire together. I was Eleanor, a senior partner at one of the most ruthless and prestigious venture capital firms on the East Coast. By the time I was 30, I had a net worth in the high 8 figures, a corner office overlooking the Manhattan skyline, and a reputation as a woman who never made a bad investment. Then, I invested in Julian. Julian was a charismatic, devastatingly handsome biotech researcher with a briefcase full of revolutionary medical blueprints and absolutely zero capital. He possessed the golden smile and the visionary rhetoric, but he lacked the strategic mind and the funding to bring his ideas to life. He claimed the corporate world had never given him a fair chance. He just needed one person to truly believe in him. I believed him so completely, so foolishly, that when my own firm refused to back his high-risk startup, I made the most monumental gamble of my life. I walked away from my lucrative career, cashed out the entirety of my trust fund and my stock options, and funneled every single penny I owned into his dying company, Aegis Biosciences. I traded my designer suits for a freezing, poorly lit laboratory office in a dilapidated industrial park. For 10 agonizing years, I was the silent engine humming beneath the hood of his success. While Julian played the brilliant scientist, tinkering with formulas and giving interviews to minor medical journals, I was the one actually keeping the lights on. I managed the grueling logistics, navigated the terrifying labyrinth of FDA approvals, negotiated with ruthless pharmaceutical vendors, and designed the proprietary operational software that eventually transformed his single, chaotic lab into a $100 million biotech behemoth. I was perfectly content to let him stand in the spotlight and take the applause. I thought we were building a dynasty together, a fortress meant to shelter us and our future children. I never suspected that while I was busy securing the structural integrity of our legacy, he was busy drafting the blueprints for my eviction. As Aegis Biosciences crossed the $100 million valuation threshold, the man who used to kiss my forehead in that freezing lab mutated into a stranger. His ego became a bloated, insatiable entity. He began treating me not as his co-founder and savior, but as a nostalgic, exhausting relic of his struggle era, a reminder of a time when he was a failure who needed his wife to pay his electricity bill. He systematically pushed me out of the executive suites, claiming my conservative venture capital mindset was stifling his boundless visionary growth. He wanted me to stay home, to be a quiet, decorative fixture in our new sprawling suburban mansion, while he played the titan of industry. He believed he could quietly discard me, siphon the wealth I had meticulously generated, and walk away with a younger, shinier model who didn't know what he looked like when he was poor. But Julian made a catastrophic miscalculation born of unchecked, blinding arrogance. He forgot that the architect who builds the fortress is the only one who knows where the structural weaknesses are. He forgot that to protect him from his early financial incompetence, I was the one who had filed the original incorporation papers. He thought he was outsmarting a tired housewife. He completely forgot that he was dealing with a venture capitalist who owned the ground his kingdom was built on. And I was about to foreclose on his entire life. The absolute confirmation of my obsolescence arrived on a quiet, rain-slicked Thursday afternoon. Julian had left for a vital investor retreat in Miami, leaving behind his custom leather golf bag in the mudroom. I had gone to move it into the garage to keep the entryway clear, but as I lifted the heavy bag, it tipped, spilling a few spare gloves and a small, zippered velvet pouch onto the tile floor. When I picked up the pouch, a heavy, sleek black object slid out into my palm. It was a secondary smartphone, a burner phone. I stood in the silence of my impeccably decorated multi-million-dollar foyer, staring at the blank screen. In my years navigating the cutthroat world of venture capital, I had learned to trust the cold, sharp prickle of intuition at the base of my neck. I didn't want to turn the phone on. Part of me, the devoted wife who had spent 10 years sacrificing her sleep, her youth, and her millions for the man she loved, wanted to drop it back into the velvet pouch and pretend I had never seen it. But the executive inside me, the woman who had built an empire from dust, knew that willful ignorance was the quickest path to bankruptcy. I pressed the power button. The screen illuminated, requesting a 4-digit passcode. Julian was a man of monumental ego but limited imagination. He viewed himself as the center of the universe, and his passwords always reflected his own milestones. I typed in the date Aegis Biosciences secured its first major patent, a date I had celebrated with him over cheap takeout in our old lab. The phone unlocked instantly. The fairy tale I had bled for shattered into a million jagged, irredeemable pieces right there in the hallway. The messages were a continuous, nauseating stream of uninhibited affection, luxury hotel confirmations, and private jet charter receipts. The recipient was saved simply as M. I scrolled up, my thumb moving with a detached, mechanical precision, until I found a photo sent a few days prior. It was a selfie taken in the reflection of a hotel bathroom mirror. Julian was standing shirtless, wrapping his arms around a blonde woman in her early 20s. I recognized her immediately. It was Madison, a 22-year-old intern who had been hired 6 months ago to assist the marketing department. She possessed a bachelor's degree in sociology and a seemingly infinite capacity for aggressive flattery. From the moment she stepped into the corporate office, she had fed Julian a steady, intoxicating diet of pure, unadulterated adulation. She looked at him as if he were a self-made god, entirely erasing the decade of sweat equity I had invested. And Julian, desperate to feel young, virile, and completely detached from the memory of his own failures, had devoured it. The physical betrayal felt like a hollow punch to the sternum, but it was the financial logistics of their romance that ignited a freezing, visceral rage deep within my marrow. I sat down on the entryway bench, my eyes scanning the text threads from the previous night. Madison, I can't wait to pick out the marble for the downtown penthouse. Are you sure the wire transfer won't trigger an alert with the board, or with your wife? Julian, don't worry about it, baby. I'm siphoning the funds from the R&D commercial expansion budget into a blind offshore LLC. Eleanor doesn't even look at the books anymore. She's too busy playing house. She's completely oblivious. Madison, when are you going to drop the dead weight? She's so dreary and old-fashioned. You deserve to be with someone who matches your energy, someone who understands your genius. Julian, give me 3 weeks. I'm securing a massive line of corporate credit against her name. Once the loan clears, I'll drop the divorce papers, file for immediate liquidation of the shared assets, and leave her with the corporate debt. By the time the lawyers figure out where the liquid cash went, we'll be sipping champagne on our new balcony, and she'll be bankrupt. She'll get exactly what she deserves for trying to hold me back. I read the words again. Leave her with the corporate debt. He wasn't just having a midlife crisis. He was actively, methodically plotting to ruin me. The man whose company I had funded with my own trust fund, the man whose initial patents I had written by hand at 3 a.m, was planning to drain the operating capital, saddle me with insurmountable debt, and throw me to the wolves so he could fund a permanent vacation with a 22-year-old intern. He believed that my exhaustion was a sign of weakness. He believed that because I had yielded the spotlight to him, I had lost my teeth. The heartbroken, dedicated wife died on that entryway bench. I didn't shed a single tear. I didn't scream, and I didn't throw his golf clubs out into the pouring rain. In the world of high-stakes corporate warfare, emotional outbursts are the ultimate liability. They are a siren warning your enemy to brace for impact. I needed Julian entirely relaxed, completely blinded by his own narcissism, and totally convinced of his own untouchable genius. I carefully memorized the account numbers mentioned in the texts, powered down the burner phone, wiped it clean of my fingerprints, and slipped it precisely back into the velvet pouch in his golf bag. When Julian returned from his investor retreat 3 days later, his skin lightly tanned and his aura radiating an insufferable, smug superiority, I greeted him at the door with a warm, placid smile. I took his coat, poured him a glass of his favorite expensive scotch, and asked him how the meetings had gone. I nodded sympathetically as he complained about the incompetence of the venture capitalists he had met, feigning awe at his brilliant negotiation tactics. Over the next 3 weeks, I delivered the greatest acting performance of my entire life. I played the role of the tired, disconnected, deeply supportive housewife to absolute, terrifying perfection. The more submissive and oblivious I acted, the bolder and sloppier Julian became. He truly believed he had outsmarted me. He thought he was playing three-dimensional chess while I was playing checkers. He had absolutely no idea that I had already flipped the board, locked the doors, and set the room on fire. While Julian was busy playing the Titan by day and the Playboy by night, I was resurrecting my past. Julian assumed that when he pushed me out of the day-to-day operations 2 years ago, I had relinquished my digital footprint within the company. He was a charismatic visionary, but he was profoundly ignorant regarding information technology and corporate governance. He forgot that I had personally designed the company's original server architecture and established the primary administrative firewalls. My master credentials were hard-coded into the firm's deepest directories, access codes Julian didn't even know existed. Night after night, while the sprawling mansion was silent and Julian was fast asleep, wrapped in his delusion of grandeur, I retreated to the guest room. I booted up my encrypted laptop and conducted a silent, devastating forensic audit of Aegis Biosciences. What I discovered was a staggering, complex web of financial infidelity that bordered on sociopathy. Julian wasn't just using his massive executive salary to fund his affair with Madison. He was actively and illegally embezzling from the company's Series B investor capital. I tracked a labyrinth of fraudulent vendor invoices for Phantom, strategic analytics services. Millions of dollars were being systematically siphoned from the corporate operating budget into a blind offshore shell company registered in the Cayman Islands. That stolen capital was what had purchased the $5 million downtown penthouse, a fleet of luxury sports cars, and the exorbitant diamond jewelry Madison flaunted on her private, locked social media accounts. It was a textbook case of fiduciary fraud, holding enough legal weight to warrant federal prison time for wire fraud and embezzlement. I meticulously documented every wire transfer, every IP log, and every fake invoice, downloading the irrefutable evidence onto a secure, encrypted external drive. But exposing his fraud to the authorities was only half the battle. I didn't just want to see him in handcuffs. I wanted to entirely repossess the empire he was trying to steal from me. To execute the kind of absolute, scorched-earth destruction Julian deserved, I had to dig deep into the physical archives of our past. I drove to a highly secure off-site storage facility where the company's oldest physical records were kept in climate-controlled vaults. I spent 8 hours sifting through decades of yellowing paperwork until I finally found what I was looking for: the original articles of incorporation filed 10 years ago. I sat on the cold concrete floor of the vault, staring at the faded signatures, and a dark, merciless smile spread across my face. When we first started the business, Julian's credit was completely decimated by a string of failed academic ventures and crippling student loan debt. To protect the new company from his personal creditors and to secure the initial business loans, I had utilized my venture capital expertise. I had legally registered the master holding company, Vanguard Innovations, exclusively in my name. Furthermore, the patents for the revolutionary biotech formulas that made Aegis Biosciences a $100 million entity were registered solely to Vanguard Innovations. Julian, blinded by a decade of public adulation and his own soaring ego, had completely forgotten the intricate corporate structure I had designed to save his life. Aegis Biosciences was nothing more than a subsidiary, a public-facing shell that leased its patents and its branding from my holding company. Julian wasn't the owner. He wasn't even a partner. Legally, irrevocably, he was simply an employee of a company that belonged entirely to me. Armed with the embezzlement audit and the unassailable foundational documents, I bypassed divorce attorneys altogether and scheduled a covert meeting with Jonathan Hayes, the most terrifying, cutthroat corporate litigator on the Eastern Seaboard. I laid the paperwork across his sprawling mahogany conference table. "I don't want a messy settlement," I told Jonathan, watching his eyes widen with profound, predatory respect as he reviewed the incorporation documents. "I want an execution. I want him terminated for cause, I want the stolen assets recovered, and I want him to walk away with absolutely nothing but the debt he tried to pin on me." Over the next 2 weeks, Jonathan and I prepared a legal guillotine disguised as a parachute. We drafted an intricate, lethal document titled the Corporate Liability Shield and Asset Severance Agreement. It was buried in 70 pages of dense, suffocating tax jargon and convoluted legal rhetoric. The trap was beautifully, wickedly simple. A week later, I approached Julian in his home office, carrying a thick binder and wearing an expression of manufactured, frantic panic. "Julian, we have a massive problem," I said, my voice trembling with artificial anxiety, my eyes wide with perfectly executed terror. "My old accountant from the VC firm just called. The IRS is initiating a retroactive audit on my personal holdings from 7 years ago. Because my name is tied to the early tax filings of Aegis, they might try to freeze the commercial expansion accounts pending the investigation. They could lock up everything." I watched the color instantly drain from his face. His eyes went wide with pure, unadulterated panic. He wasn't worried about me facing an audit. He was terrified that a federal freeze would lock the offshore accounts he was actively using to finalize the purchase of the penthouse for Madison. An audit. He choked out, standing up from his desk, his hands shaking slightly. "Are you kidding me? Eleanor, we are in the middle of a massive quarterly expansion. You can't let the IRS touch my company." "I won't," I assured him, sliding the thick legal binder across his desk with trembling hands. "My lawyers worked all night to draft this. It's a corporate liability shield. It immediately, legally separates your business from my personal assets. It shifts all corporate liability, debt, and equity exclusively to your name, effectively shielding your accounts from my audit. But you have to sign it right now, before the IRS files the official injunction tomorrow morning." He looked at the binder like a drowning man looking at a life raft. I knew Julian intimately. I knew he despised reading complex legal documents, and I knew his overwhelming greed and fear of losing his stolen money would completely blind him. "If I sign this, the firm's money is safe?" he asked, his eyes darting hungrily to the yellow signature tabs. "Completely untouched," I lied smoothly. Without hesitation, Julian grabbed his solid gold fountain pen and began aggressively signing his name on every marked page. He thought he was saving his offshore accounts. He thought he was severing himself from my sinking ship, successfully saddling me with my own destruction. He had absolutely no idea that buried within those pages was an irrevocable admission of his financial embezzlement, a total forfeiture of his executive equity as restitution, and a clause that legally transferred the entirety of his personal assets to Vanguard Innovations to cover the stolen funds. He was willingly signing his own financial death warrant. He capped his pen, exhaled a massive sigh of relief, and looked at me with a patronizing, pitying smile. "Thank God we caught this, Eleanor. Don't worry, I'll have my team look into your audit once my expansion is finalized." "Thank you, Julian," I said, pulling the signed documents back toward me, my heart beating with the cold, steady rhythm of a metronome. "But I think the expansion is already complete." The morning of the Aegis Biosciences 10-year anniversary gala arrived with a crisp, clear sky that perfectly mirrored my internal landscape. For months, Julian had been hyping this specific event to the press and his board as the dawn of a new era for the firm. He had rented out the grand ballroom of the city's most prestigious hotel, sparing absolutely no expense, using investor funds, naturally, to throw himself a coronation. According to the internal emails I had intercepted, his agenda was meticulously planned. He would stand before the investors, announce a massive new merger, officially debut Madison to the corporate world as his vice president of strategic initiatives, and then, returning home that evening a fabulously wealthy, liberated man, he would finally serve me with the divorce papers. He was dressing for absolute victory. He stood in front of the hallway mirror that morning, adjusting the lapels of a bespoke Italian tuxedo, his chest puffed out with sheer, intoxicating arrogance. "I really think it's best if you stay home tonight, Eleanor," he said dismissively, not even bothering to meet my eyes in the reflection. "This is a highly sophisticated crowd. The investors want to see the vibrant future of the firm and, frankly, you don't fit the brand anymore. You'd just be uncomfortable. Rest up. I'll see you tomorrow." "Have a wonderful night, Julian," I replied softly, offering him a blank, compliant smile. "I'm sure it will be an evening you'll never forget." He scoffed, grabbed his leather briefcase, and walked out the door without a second glance. An hour later, I shed the oversized, beige cardigan and the sensible slacks that had comprised my stay-at-home uniform for the past 2 years. I stepped into a fiercely structured, custom-tailored white designer suit that cost more than Julian's first laboratory lease. I slipped on a pair of sharp stilettos, applied a bold slash of crimson lipstick, and looked at myself in the full-length mirror. The weary, discarded wife was gone. The venture capital titan had returned, and she was out for blood. I arrived at the towering downtown hotel precisely at 9:15 p.m., exactly 15 minutes after Julian had taken the stage. Flanking me on either side were Jonathan Hayes and 3 of the most terrifying corporate litigators in the city, carrying heavy leather briefcases containing Julian's absolute ruin. We bypassed the hotel security, my credentials, and the sheer, intimidating force of my entourage, granting me immediate, unquestioned access to the grand ballroom doors. Through the frosted glass panels, I could see the scene unfolding perfectly. The room was packed with venture capitalists, senior executives, and key investors. Julian was holding court on the brightly lit stage, pacing confidently, gesturing toward a massive digital projector screen detailing projected quarterly growth. Seated in the front row, wearing an entirely inappropriate, plunging cocktail dress and a smug, proprietary smile, was Madison. She was looking up at Julian as if he were a god, completely unaware that he was about to be crucified. I didn't knock. I pushed the heavy double doors open. They hit the stoppers with a thunderous crack that echoed through the cavernous ballroom like a gunshot. The entire room went dead silent. Hundreds of heads snapped toward the entrance. My legal team stepped in behind me, fanning out with an intimidating military precision, shutting the doors and effectively sealing the room. Julian froze mid-stride on the stage. His hand, pointing toward the projection screen, slowly lowered. The golden, charismatic smile slid completely off his face, replaced by a look of profound, staggering confusion. He stared at my designer suit, the terrifying lawyers at my back, and the posture of absolute, unyielding authority I commanded. Eleanor. Julian stammered over his lapel microphone, his confident baritone cracking into a high, pathetic pitch. What are you doing here? This is a closed investor session. You need to leave. Now. I have no intention of leaving, Julian, I said, my voice cold, steady, and carrying effortlessly to every corner of the silent room. I walked slowly down the center aisle, my heels clicking rhythmically against the marble floor, the crowd parting for me as if I were parting the sea. Because a new era for this company is exactly what we are here to discuss, though my agenda differs significantly from yours. Security, Julian shouted, his panic breaking through his polished facade. He pointed a trembling finger at me, looking wildly at the hotel staff. Someone call security. Get her out of here. Sit down, Julian, I commanded, the sheer, icy force of my tone stopping the security guards in their tracks. I turned to the lead investors in the front row, men and women I had personally secured during the grueling early years of the business. Ladies and gentlemen, you were brought here today to approve a massive merger and to welcome the young woman sitting in the front row as your new vice president. Before you applaud, there is a piece of vital financial analytics you need to review. I nodded to Jonathan. He stepped over to the AV console at the side of the stage, seamlessly overriding Julian's presentation laptop with an encrypted USB drive. The massive screen behind Julian flared violently. His meaningless growth charts vanished, replaced by the high-definition, meticulously highlighted forensic audit of his offshore shell company. For the past 14 months, I announced to the captive, horrified audience, projecting my voice over the rising tide of panicked whispers. The CEO of this firm has been executing a systematic, highly illegal embezzlement campaign. He has utilized fraudulent vendor invoices to siphon over $18 million of your investor capital into a blind offshore trust. I clicked a sleek remote in my hand. The screen shifted to display the wire transfer receipts, the deed to the $5 million downtown penthouse, and the title registrations for 2 luxury sports cars, all bearing the name of Madison, the proposed vice president of strategic initiatives. A collective, sharp gasp swept through the ballroom. Several venture capitalists instantly leaped to their feet, their faces pale with shock and rising fury. Madison shrank back into her chair, her smug smile replaced by a look of sheer, white-knuckled terror. She threw her hands over her face, trying to hide from the blinding glare of the projector screen. "Turn it off." Julian shrieked, lunging toward the AV console, his composure entirely destroyed. "She's lying. These are fabricated." She's a bitter, hysterical housewife, trying to ruin me because I asked for a divorce. "I am not a housewife, Julian," I said, stepping directly onto the edge of the stage, forcing him to stop or physically collide with me. I looked up into his sweating, panicked face. "I am the auditor, and the math never lies." The atmosphere in the ballroom was electric with catastrophic realization. The investors, staring at the irrefutable evidence of stolen millions projected 30 feet high across the wall, were no longer looking at Julian with the reverence reserved for a visionary. They were looking at him with the absolute, visceral disgust reserved for a thief who had been caught with his hands deep inside their pockets. Julian's chest was heaving. He looked wildly around the room, desperate to find a single sympathetic face, but he was met with nothing but stony silence and outright hostility. He had spent years cultivating his image as a self-made titan, but the screen behind him laid bare the pathetic, grasping reality of his fraud. "Julian, is this true?" demanded Marcus, the lead representative of our largest venture capital firm. His voice was dangerously quiet. "Did you funnel $18 million of operational capital to buy a penthouse for an intern?" "No, Marcus, listen to me, it's a setup." Julian pleaded, his voice reaching a shrill, undignified pitch. He pointed a shaking finger at me. "She hacked my accounts. She manufactured these transfers. She has no proof." "I have the digital footprint of every single keystroke," I corrected smoothly, my voice slicing through his panic. "And the federal authorities will have the complete, unredacted drive by tomorrow morning." I turned away from his trembling figure and signaled Jonathan, who stepped forward and dropped a massive, heavy, red-tabbed binder directly onto the podium. The dull thud echoed through the microphones. "But the embezzlement is only the secondary agenda item for tonight's gala," I announced, projecting my voice to the far end of the room. "Julian has continually represented himself to this board and to the public as the founder, sole owner, and majority shareholder of Aegis Biosciences." Julian froze, a new, entirely different kind of terror dawning in his eyes. He stared at the red-tabbed binder, his mind racing backward 10 years, trying to remember the paperwork he had gladly ignored when we were starving in a freezing laboratory. "However," I continued, unlatching the binder and opening it to the yellowed, original articles of incorporation. "When this company was founded, Julian possessed a credit score that disqualified him from holding a basic checking account. To protect the entity from his personal creditors, the master holding company, Vanguard Innovations, was registered exclusively to me." I held the original, notarized documents up for the front row to see. "Furthermore," I said, the absolute weight of my victory finally crystallizing in the air, "the patents for the proprietary biotech formulas, the trademarks, and the core operational software are all owned solely by Vanguard. Aegis Biosciences is merely a subsidiary operating under a licensing agreement. An agreement that I, as the sole legal owner of the holding company, am terminating right now." Julian stumbled backward, his hip crashing into the projector screen stand. The blood drained so completely from his face he looked as though he might pass out. No, Eleanor, you can't do this. We're married. It's community property." "The holding company predates our marriage by 2 months," Jonathan interjected over the microphone, his voice dripping with legal finality. "And the capital used to establish it was drawn entirely from Ms. Sterling's premarital trust fund. You have absolutely no equity claim, Julian. You do not own this company. You are simply an at-will employee." "But the liability shield." Julian gasped, his eyes widening as the memory of the documents he had signed a week ago flooded his brain. "I signed the shield to protect the accounts." "You signed a post-nuptial severance agreement," I whispered, stepping so close to him only the first row could hear. "You legally confessed to the financial fraud. You assumed sole responsibility for the $18 million in embezzled debt, and you irrevocably forfeited all of your remaining executive equity as restitution to my holding company." I stepped back to the microphone. "And you are fired," I said, looking directly into his eyes. "Effective immediately, for criminal fraud, fiduciary breach, and gross misconduct. Your corporate credit cards have already been deactivated, and my legal team has filed injunctions freezing your personal accounts to begin recovering the stolen assets. Julian was entirely broken. He looked at the legal binder, he looked at the hostile board of investors who were already pulling out their phones to call their own legal teams, and then he turned his desperate, tear-filled eyes toward Madison. "Madison," he choked out, dropping off the stage and reaching a hand toward her front row seat. "Madison, call the real estate lawyers. We can leverage the penthouse, we can fight this, we can run." Madison, realizing with terrifying clarity that the man she had attached herself to was no longer a billionaire CEO, but a bankrupt, soon-to-be federal inmate, practically leaped out of her chair. "Don't talk to me," she shrieked, backing away from him as if he were covered in flames. The smug, proprietary mistress was gone, replaced by a terrified opportunist looking for an exit. She turned to the board, her hands raised defensively. "I didn't know anything about the stolen money. He told me it was from his personal trust. I am a victim here. I'm resigning immediately." Without waiting for a response, Madison grabbed her designer handbag, pushed past Julian, and sprinted down the center aisle, fleeing the ballroom with breathtaking speed. She abandoned him the precise second the bank account hit zero. Julian let out a hollow, devastated sob. He was completely alone, trapped in a room full of people who were actively drafting lawsuits against him. "Security," I said calmly, looking at the hotel guards who were now taking their cues exclusively from me. "Please escort Julian off my property. He is not to take anything but the suit on his back." Julian didn't fight. He didn't scream or curse. His legs simply gave out. The guards grabbed him by the elbows, hauling his dead weight up and dragging him backward down the aisle. As he was pulled out of the ballroom, the golden boy of biotechnology wept openly, stripped of his empire, his mistress, and his dignity in less than 10 minutes. I turned back to the stunned, silent board. I walked to the podium, adjusted the microphone, and looked out over the sea of faces. "Now," I said, my voice steady and commanding, "let's discuss how we are going to fix the supply chain delays." The purge of Julian's toxic influence was executed with the kind of ruthless efficiency I had applied to my venture capital firm years ago. Once his bloated ego, reckless spending, and constant need for validation were removed from the equation, Aegis Biosciences didn't just stabilize, it thrived. The board of directors, initially terrified by the ballroom bloodbath, quickly realized that the woman standing at the podium was vastly superior to the man they had idolized. I streamlined the research and development pipeline, cut the absurd marketing budgets Julian had used to fund his mistress, and drove the company's valuation to unprecedented global heights within a single fiscal year. The divorce was profoundly one-sided. Facing an ironclad federal indictment for the embezzlement and wire fraud, Julian was forced to sign a settlement agreement entirely dictated by my lawyers. He surrendered his claim to the suburban estate, handed over the keys to the luxury cars, and agreed to crippling restitution payments just to avoid a maximum security prison sentence. The downtown penthouse was seized, liquidated, and the funds were returned to the investor pool. Madison, realizing she would be implicated in the fraud if she fought for the property, vanished into obscurity, her reputation in the corporate world permanently ruined. For the first time in 10 years, my brilliance was no longer acting as invisible scaffolding. I moved out of the stifling suburban house and purchased a breathtaking, ultra-modern penthouse downtown. I officially took the title of CEO, surrounded myself with fierce, intelligent peers who respected my strategic mind, and sat firmly on a throne of my own making. The man who had traded me for pennies was left with nothing, while I kept the millions I had rightfully earned. A valuable lesson for the listener. If there is one profound, echoing truth to take away from Eleanor's journey, it is this: never sacrifice your millions for a man who is willing to trade you for pennies. For a decade, Eleanor believed that true love meant setting herself on fire to keep her partner warm. She defined her worth by her utility, sacrificing her incredibly successful career, her trust fund, and her own spotlight to build a foundation for her husband. She assumed that her unwavering loyalty would eventually be rewarded with lifelong security and respect. But when you build an empire for someone who only loves the view, they will eventually try to push you off the balcony so they don't have to share the credit. Society often conditions us to believe that the greatest expression of devotion is self-erasure. We are told to quietly manage our partner's insecurities, do the heavy lifting in the shadows, and let them take the applause to keep the peace. But a user does not respect the host that feeds them. They simply grow entitled to the sacrifices. They will gladly take your million-dollar dedication and trade it for the cheap, penny-level validation of someone who flatters their ego. True empowerment does not mean waiting for someone to acknowledge your sacrifices. It means recognizing your own undeniable worth, refusing to be a stepping stone, and having the absolute courage to tear down the people who try to exploit your generosity. Do not let your hard work, your intellect, and your loyalty fund someone else's arrogance. Reclaim your assets. Step out of the shadows. Stop pouring your gold into the hands of those who only know how to count copper. And remember, the person strong enough to build the empire is always the one who truly deserves to rule it.